Okay.
Now we're live. Great. Welcome everybody. We are live. Thanks for bearing with us as we had some tech difficulties, but we're here now. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Rachael Ward. I'm the Farmers Market Support Project Manager here at Farmers Market Coalition, or FMC. And today we're talking with Sagdrina Jalal, who is the head facilitator of the process to create the anti-racist Farmers Market Toolkit. For those of you who haven't already heard, the toolkit was released last week and it was developed by a group of Black food system leaders and market managers with the support of FMC. The Anti-Racist Farmers Market Toolkit offers ways for market managers to reflect an anti-racist lens within their farmers market organizations, while also making necessary adjustments to the structure, design, and operations of the market itself. You can download the toolkit on FMC's website, and we will put a link in the chat to the page on our website where you can learn more about the toolkit. You can also learn at that link about the 10 experts who created the toolkit and how to reach out to them for speaking or consulting opportunities. I want to make sure that we give them all recognition in this space. So I'm going to read through their names and their roles and what they do outside of the work of the toolkit really quickly, and then we'll get started. So of course, we have Sagdrina Jalal here. She's the head facilitator of the process. Nedra Deadweiler was our lead researcher. We have Shiny Flannery, who acted as a work group member and then an editor in the later stages. Huge shout out and thanks to her for all of her hard work on this process and pulling together all those ideas into one cohesive document. Other work group members included Terrence Jackson of Tuskegee, Kiana Mickey of QJM Multiprise, Juju Harris, who's an author, culinary educator, and gardener, Carla Forrest Hewitt of East Lansing Farmers Market, Julia Lynn Walker of Ohio Farmers Market Network, Cheryl Wilby of the Schenectady Green Market and Soulfire Farms, Aja Embry of the East Atlanta Village Farmers Market, April Jones of Pinehurst Farmers Market, and Stacy Whitney of Altadena Farmers Market. Thank you all so much for your hard work. We're so happy that what you created is out into the world, and we're happy to be talking about it, promoting it, sharing it. So I want to start us off with some brief introductions. Sagdrina, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about how you came to this work?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much, Rachael, for kind of setting the tone and bringing everybody kind of up to speed with who I represent. It's very important to me that it's abundantly clear that this was a collective work. And so I'm going to do my best to both share my experience as an individual, as a leader in the food space, but the most important thing is to reflect the brilliance of my co-collaborators. So thank you so much for setting that tone. I am, again, Sagdrina. I am serving primarily now as the Senior Director of Community Innovation at the Center for Civic Innovation. And that is kind of a greater role than in terms of addressing systems level change and the challenges that communities face. But my heart certainly has always been in the food space. Fortunately, at CCI, I get to work with food leaders here in Atlanta, but I also work with women and others that are very focused on addressing the issues that that we face in our community across the board. So I think for me, this opportunity to work on the toolkit was an opportunity to bring both my roots from the full food system into the space, as well as kind of an expanded understanding of how community functions best, and what's needed in order to make sure that we are creating places of belonging.
Yeah, Sagdrina and I were very lucky to work together for many years when I lived in Georgia and when she was the executive director of the Georgia Farmers Market Association. And so I'm glad that we've stayed in touch. And I was so excited when this opportunity came up to collaborate and work together again. Do you want to share a little bit more about, at the beginning of these stages, what was that context for how this toolkit and the idea for the toolkit came to be?
Well, I mean, first of all, you're kind of downplaying our history, like,
I'm sorry. You
which
need
is so,
to.
which is so cool. Like, I think like when you start listening to community and once you realize how incredible community is, like you have to acknowledge the community that already exists. And so I feel that you and I have a history of both being in community together and supporting community together. And so at the most foundational level, I think your role at FMC and kind of having the opportunity to think through some creative ways to, create growth opportunities and shared learning. You were able to tap into like an existing framework that we created. And I think that's the beauty of community, right? So,
Mhm.
and when we first started talking about this, I think there was a shared understanding between the two of us on like our values as individuals, and then some of the goals that FMC has as an organization, and what we know to be and what we knew to be, particularly in 2020 when we first started having the conversation, to be a very strong need to address some inequities in communities across our country in general. And through farmers markets, being able to host the conversation was incredible. So I'd say, just starting with the relationship that existed between the two of us, the readiness for Farmers Market Coalition to take on the topic, and then the early conversations around how do we bring folks who are already experts, subject matter experts in this, doing the work, have the experience together, was, kind of where we started.
Yeah, thank you for not letting me sell our relationship short. By all means, yeah, and that is the beauty of building strong relationships and connections and community, is that when demands for resources like this come up, you can check in with your community and say, hey, do you know anything that exists like this? If not, let's create it together. And who do you think would be good to help make that happen? So I think, this has been over almost 2 years of a process since we first started talking about this toolkit and the idea for it. And I think that the approach that we've gone through, that we used to develop the toolkit, the work group that's brought together, is really something unique in terms of other projects that I've seen and worked on, and that there were just so many lessons that happen along that way for me as an individual, for Farmers Market Coalition, for the work group members. And those lessons are so applicable to the way that we approach projects, the way that we approach community work in general. And so I'd love to hear from your perspective, Sagdrina. What do you think were some of the things that are unique about this approach compared to other projects or other ways that you've seen this type of work done?
Yeah, I mean, I think just at the onset, the focus on like true collaboration, and understanding that of course we're stronger together, but defining what that means in terms of like understanding where my strengths are, where they are not, and how we leverage all of our individual skills and talents to and access, right? So in the case of FMC, just the proximity to the funding, whereas when it came to facilitation, Nedra, of course, really led on like the research component of things, and really kind of helping us um, to organize our thoughts and our conversation in a way that was true to us as a group, as well as representative of the greater collective. I think those things really speak to the way that Black folks organize, like when we are just when we create the space, or when space is is allowed to be created, and sometimes in, you know, that where it's not normally present, where it might be like in a project, you know, that might be spearheaded by someone like FMC, giving room for these leaders to show up authentically, and to really create a body of work that is not only applicable to farmers markets, but is culturally relevant, was something that I think we were thinking about from the beginning. So everything from, again, you know, me and your conversation about the value of having someone like Nedra, who is a historian and really at one of the purest community organizers that I know, come in and at the formative stage of this project to make sure that in addition to us speaking the farmers market language, that we were speaking universal language as it relates to creating spaces of belonging. So that level of intentionality, along with considering diversity within those who identify as Black and may have interest in participating in the working group, just so that we could have as much thought leadership from a cross section of the Black community, was another, I think, really key, unique aspect of how we developed the group itself.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that we wrote a blog about this for FMC Lessons in Process, and maybe Michael or Hannah can drop that in the chat as well if folks want to learn more about it. But part of that blog was really from FMC's perspective, learning how do you, when you're trying to give over ownership and leadership of a project, how do you step back but not out completely? And so I think we had to learn that throughout this process of like, where do we pull back, and also where do you all need us to step up a little bit more and do more, or use our resources to leverage, you know, that funding, or leverage the administrative systems that we have to support the project. Figuring out, you know, it kind of changed the way that I look at community work. It's a lot less of, well, y'all have the solutions, you just do it. But it's like, you know, I recognize your expertise, I value your insight, I value the perspective that you bring, and let me help you bring that to a reality, or let me help you elevate that, to make sure that more folks can hear what you have to say, and that it gets out into the world. And so that application process, as you mentioned, was something that I thought was pretty, the way that we looked at folks across the food system, the way that we were looking for Black folks specifically. We had to go kind of around some and navigate some challenges there of how do we be direct but not so direct, and that's a challenge. But you know, and I think that's a question that we still get about the toolkit, right? Is why Black folks specifically? Did we work with them for this toolkit? Do you want to talk to that more a little bit?
Well, I mean, I guess I would say, why not Black folks? You know,
Right.
so so that's like the obvious answer.
Mm-hmm.
But why Black folks? Because I think that, you know, particularly given like we can no longer pretend that like having a hashtag with a sign in your yard, you know, is indicative of change. Like there has
Mm-hmm.
been just too many very clear and distinct experiences that illustrate that, you know, the value of Black folks is not only limited in certain spaces, but like creating the lack of value is creating harm, and in some trauma, and in some cases death. And so I think like those very real realities that everyone across this country have been faced with, and our attention was, you know, we were able to be, we were a captive audience, like collectively, because, you know, we are dealing with this pandemic. And so things that were distractions in terms of what's happening in our community or what's happening in communities across the country, you know, we were in a space where we could all kind of we had to sit with it. And so I think it's just very clear that the need, to acknowledge and atone, and then therefore next step being healing and changing policy and procedures, is just, I think it was a call to action for everyone in every industry. This is just the way that I think FMC decided to, quite frankly, bravely step up and say, yes, we are going to address this need in our community as a part of a greater, issue that we're dealing with countrywide, worldwide, on the devaluation of Black bodies. So.
Exactly. Yes. And especially within food system work and farmers market work, we know that those experiences are so wrapped up into food system work. And so really working with populations that have that historical context and current context of, being excluded from the food system or being used for the purposes of growing the food system, right? Like, to be frank, it's really going to that initial source, I think, was really important for us too.
Yeah. And I also just want to add, and this is something that was reinforced. We had a very early conversation when the toolkit was being developed at the Intense conference in 2021, the virtual Intense conference. And one of the things that emerged very early on, well, let me just back up and say this. When we started the working group and what we knew, Nedra was just a very, very big part of helping, us to think through how we establish and build trust and community within the working group. And we spent a lot of time doing that. We spent a lot of time just getting to know each other, sharing experiences, offering just as safe a space as we could muster, given kind of all of the considerations. We spent a lot of time on that. And I think that was super important, because as we shifted more and more towards building an actual toolkit, that was just an understanding, a layer of our like it was our collective healing and our collective work. And so those presets were there for us to just build on. And so when we had our first conversation, Shiny, Cheryl, and I were talking, and we were able to, like, a lot of, the assumptions that we think, we wanted to make sure that people had about this work, we were able to address those, and then get on to talking about Black joy and the opportunity, in addition to atonement, in addition to healing, and in addition to erasing barriers. We were also able to talk about the missed opportunity that I think a lot of markets have in not really engaging Black people in their markets in a very intentional way. And the way that it emerged, that I thought was just really, really dope, was this conversation around music, and music at farmers markets in particular, and how important that we find, as those of us who have been a part of the development or, the leadership of farmers markets in either Black communities or led by Black folks, that music component is something that really can be a driving factor to pulling people together. And there was such strong response from the viewers of that particular segment. And that's just a very small example of how very naturally we started considering and thinking the unique brilliance and ways that we talk about the work and think about it as a community-wide opportunity for engagement, as opposed to simply thinking about it in the context of how it fits into the food system.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, that music conversation was really interesting. I think there were a lot of market managers that were out there that said, I'm sick of bluegrass too. I'm sorry, but we need to switch it up sometimes.
Yes, yes,
And yeah, really thinking about, diversity of music is just one small thing that you really can do to change the entire atmosphere and vibe of your market. Definitely.
absolutely.
I want to go back to what you were talking about, this process creating a healing space. And that was really in that blog, the Lessons in Process blog, you and Nedra really wrote about how that healing space was used to validate and support the experiences of that work group members have had at farmers markets. So why was it important to start from that like basic level of creating that trust and that healing space? And how is that something that we could do in other projects or other ways that we approach this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to the intentionality of having diverse members of the group. So we knew that we had this rich kind of representation um, in terms of age, as well as, like I said, geographic, urban versus rural. And so with that just comes a combination of experience and an opportunity for us to learn from each other. So what it is like to be running a market in a community that is extremely diverse, right? That's one set of experiences that the working group members have. And then there are other working group members who run, markets that are entirely attended by Black customers. I'm sorry, white customers, and have largely white vendors, but they know that there is a need and an opportunity to reach out to more Black vendors, to engage more Black vendors, to engage Black customers. But it's like, how does that person's experience with challenges, maybe in being able to be effective in their role, lend itself or inform the way that we structure the toolkit? And so I think like really hearing each other's experiences and stories, and just considering the fact that there were a lot of similarities, but there were also some very unique challenges. We also had diversity in terms of the role that people play. We have market managers that are on the kit, that worked on the toolkit. We also have food educators, we have farmers and market vendors, and then we have people who have played multiple roles and in those spaces, as well as advocacy work and broader systems level change work, like myself. So I think that there was just quite a strong need for us to capture each other's experience and know, like, okay, when we need clarification on management and how we could incorporate those things. And that's really what the group did, is that we divided and conquered in terms of the segments of the toolkit. And I also want to shout out Dar from FMC and Nina from FMC, just in terms of the back and behind the scenes support. That's something that I think that the group feels very strongly about, is, to your point earlier, having knowing that some of those administrative pieces were being managed, and maybe some of those initial, and Hannah too, I mean, just shout out because some of those maybe initial areas of confusion in terms of like, why a Black toolkit, why only Black folks working on it, like FMC took on the lion's share of that, which allowed us to stay focused and on that community building piece within our group, and then also the task at hand at developing, this really rich document.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's, so often that's a great role for white folks to play in these types of roles, is to be the fielder in some ways, not a gatekeeper, but really like a fielder and a filter for some of those questions, to call fellow white folks in and have that conversation about, why we're approaching this in the way that we are, so that it isn't, it's not another layer of questions that you have to deal with. You can focus on doing the work. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, because like your original question, part of it at least, was how is this process, how is it used to support other similar work and like as a framework? And I think what you just said is like super important and really needs to be emphasized, is that, community knows what community needs. And at the most fundamental level, what was needed in this space was for for white folks to kind of get out of the way of the access to the resource. So the resource was established, the funding was established, and then let the folks who have that intrinsic knowledge, that proximity to the issue, the very formal education. I don't want to downplay the fact that, a good bit of the folks that are on this, in this group, have done all sorts of things outside of local food system work and have chosen this as their personal passion and mission. So in addition to their local food system work, we have, researchers, scientists, social workers, teachers, educators that were a part of this toolkit and able to really lend those skills as well. So I think, starting out with kind of an understanding, a baseline understanding that bringing in the community is automatically going to bring in new ideas and thoughts, and that's what's desired, and it's going to be challenging, and that there have to be checkpoints along the way, is super important to the success of any project like this. Nedra and I talk about the fact that she and we've done other projects together. We worked on an outdoor recreational project, kind of a place-making project in a community here called Chattahoochee Hills. And it was a really great project. I think one of the things that we talk about with the FMC project is the combination of having the funding plus the support of FMC that had key folks like you that kind of get it and have done some of the work already, along with being able to tap into just a vast network of Black leaders to really pull this together, made this project uniquely positioned to have immediate impact in a way that other things kind of struggle to.
Yeah, and that was very intentional on our part too. We're very lucky to have had flexible funding for it. We're very lucky to have had the support of Ben, our executive director, and Dar as a director of farmers market support folks to really say, we want this created, but we're going to let go of all expectations of what it is, what it looks like, the timeline of when it has to be done. And so, I'm a project manager, and part of that is really hard for me to just let it go, and let other folks drive it and lead it, and be okay with a very slow and intentional process, and sometimes a process that comes back on itself, right? Sometimes we pause and we say we need to revisit the goals or why we're doing this, or we need to slow this down more. And I think that we did that a lot throughout the creation of the toolkit. Do you want to talk a little bit more about why it's important not to have a strict deadline or a timeline, or to really leave space for slowing down, for reiterating, for going back?
Well, I think that the interesting thing about the timing of this toolkit, as it relates to that point, is that we were in the middle of a global pandemic. And so we were there was no choice, in addition to people were dealing with utter devastation. And so I know that there were folks that really tried business as usual, but the reality is that I think slowed down the work as opposed to speeding it up. And so I think that it was clear to me that in addition to all the other considerations of what happens when you bring very busy and brilliant people together, the fact that we were living in a space where nothing was clear. We were having a hard time seeing, what next week would bring. And then, in some cases, next month, in terms of our personal experiences, family members being sick and passing away from COVID, to, just job situations, living situations, all those very, very real things made it just a requirement that we show up every single meeting, understanding that something that happened to a work group member from one meeting to the next may need to be the focus of that session, right? But also understanding that all of those experiences contribute to our ability to create something that is authentic and really real and responsive to what's happening in real time. So I think that that flexibility and understanding and that process, when we are able to share the toolkit, like we've shared it with folks that have downloaded it, but when as people start to engage the working group members on implementing the strategies, it will be very easy for us to guide markets in that same type of like, yes, let's go all in, let's provide support, let's be willing to bring it back, dial it back when we need to, let's dig in and go hard in the paint when we need to. I think there are all of these kinds of lessons that we modeled through the formation of this toolkit that we'll be able to carry into the implementation of the strategies.
Yeah, exactly. And you know that I'm just like struck by that recognition of humanity that you have, and that you and Nedra brought to each work group session so clearly, like you're saying, you know, recognizing people for being people and not just machines that produce something, right? Or produce work or are focused on work. And oftentimes I think just slowing down, recognizing where folks are at, giving a chance for a long check-in for folks to share where their mind is and where their focus has been, or things that are pulling them away from this work, is such a huge antidote to that white supremacy culture of the sense of urgency and this like needless and oftentimes completely arbitrary sense of urgency that we put on things to be completed by a certain time. And so when we can let go of that by really focusing on the humanity of folks and their situations, we end up with really like an end result that is so much better than we ever could have imagined. Like I really think that if we would have said like, we want this toolkit done in a year, and like, we want a draft by this time and this time and this time, like what we would have ended up with would have been not great. You know, like it would have been pretty rigid. It would have been, we would have made it happen, but it would not have been as intentional or as impactful as I think that it is because of the way that that you all approached it. So
Yeah, I agree.
definitely. I want to talk a little bit more about um, our hopes and dreams for the toolkit too. So, you know, it's out there, it's in the world. Hopefully folks are reading it. We got like 300 downloads in the first couple of days that it was released. So it's a highly sought after resource. And I know that farmers markets are combing through it and reading it. But I want to hear from you, and if you can represent some of the work group members as they've shared with you, what impact do we hope to see this toolkit have on the field of farmers markets, on other parts of the local food system, on other fields altogether?
Absolutely. I think one thing that that came up a lot and that we thought through a lot is the fact that we wanted the toolkit to be itself to be open source. We wanted to make sure that everyone had access to the framework. I think it's also important to note that we understand that it's a lot, right? And for many markets, it would be where our recommendations, the outline, the structure, the considerations, you know, are going to be curated for each individual set of circumstances. And so I just want to acknowledge that. And so we definitely feel like embedded in the implementation really needs to be engagement with someone who can support the markets as they are implementing those strategies. I think it would be really difficult, if not impossible, to just take the toolkit as it is and just run with it. I would even personally be hesitant to do that, to be honest. So I think like, just understanding that at the core of implementing this is really adopting the mindset of, the working group and engaging folks who really understand this on a very deep level is super important in terms of the context by which I talk about hopes and dreams, right? So, I would love to see this toolkit be implemented in markets across the country. I would love to see market leaders, whether they be, a vendor or a board member or the leader of the market, to see this as an opportunity to identify themselves as agents of change for their community. And I think that is something like the role of the market manager, Hannah, at the Intense conference, which, by the way, shout out to Kat White and all the folks at Intense. If you didn't attend that, put it on your calendar for next year. It's such a great conference for markets, and really just this whole idea around how we can be better humans. But Hannah had a session on just the incredible responsibility and role and value that market managers in particular and leaders play, and how that is not celebrated enough, captured enough, valued enough. And I just completely agree. In my hopes and dreams, in addition to that being a role that's just deeply valued and respected in community, that this toolkit gives like one pathway, right, to like defining the role of a leader as it relates to improving the experience of the community. And I mean a leader in general. So in this case, a market leader, but a community leader of any kind.
Exactly. Yeah. And that idea of farmers markets as agents of change is something that FMC is really trying to do better about articulating, and why we see the farmers markets as that's their role in the food system. They can be incubators, they can be agents of systemic change. Ben recently wrote a blog about it, so we can put that in the chat for folks to read too. But yeah, I want to go back. You were saying about market managers approaching this work, and why it's so important to work with in community with someone, whether it be a work group member or like a local consultant that does racial equity and inclusion and diversity work. I think that so often when we're trying to make changes, we can receive input and criticism, constructive criticism, in a very defensive way, right? And so we can get very much like, well, my market isn't like that, is it? And sometimes that blinds us to really seeing how things are, and having an outside perspective can really help, wake us up to that, can help us see, okay, this thing that I've been doing that I thought was great, maybe isn't great for everybody, or maybe I could change the way that I'm doing this. And I think that I really encourage, market managers out there to approach reading the toolkit with a really open mind, to be very self-reflective and say, and instead of looking for ways that you can dismiss yourself out of this work, really, how can you call yourself into this work and say, I could do better about this, or we could do more here, or we haven't even started on this yet. And realize that anti-racism work is lifelong work. It's not something that we're going to get to check, you've implemented the toolkit and now you're an anti-racist farmers market. It doesn't work that way. It's really good. It's got to be built into the structures, to the policies, to the ways that you run your market. And it has to be ongoing, as there's turnover, as there's changes in your boards and your vendors, like those values are still standing true. And that can be really challenging.
Yeah, I always refer to, we have a local organization in Atlanta that does diversity, equity, inclusion work that supported the Center for Civic Innovation in our internal examination of our policies and practices and just kind of our culture. And when we would host sessions, one of the things that we kind of led with was this concept that we're all on our individual and independent paths towards liberation from white supremacy, right? And so some of us are just considering it for the first time. Some of us have been very, clearly and consistently and lifelong impacted by it. So, within that spectrum of understanding, there should be space for everyone to kind of coexist. So I think that, just the kind of the need and the understanding, not that anyone gets a pass, from, really acknowledging the need for healing. I think that's kind of where we have to be careful that defensiveness sometimes can be our way of just kind of like disconnecting from the work, but also that defensiveness is just sometimes coming from a place of, I need space to really process my role here. And, I may need to do some research on my own, do some reading on my own to catch up, to where other people may be to a certain extent. This is still my individual journey. And as you said, it's a lifelong journey.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a good antidote to that defensiveness is, yeah, stepping back and figuring out how can you learn more? How can you approach this as, yeah, as a student who is constantly learning. I think so. This is an anti-racist farmers market toolkit. It talks specifically about farmers markets, but there's so many elements here of what we're talking about that apply to others types of retail outlets, CSA programs or food hubs or other urban ag and gardening. Like there's just so much here. So do you have any ideas around how this could ripple out to other parts of the local food system?
Yes, I mean, to your point, we kind of structured this around like an existing framework that Dar and I had worked on together, the 4 M's of kind of like 4 areas of focus for farmers markets: measurement, mission, management, and marketing, I think. Is
Yes.
that them?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was like counting them off in my head too. I'm like, be ready to
Yes.
jump in with the fourth M because I always forget the fourth one.
Yes, me too. But I think like first considering like each one of those buckets and thinking about, okay, how do these recommendations within those buckets, like the management piece might be more specific to a farmer's market, right? Because there's specific things about managing a market that are considerations. But like when you talk about marketing and layering in some anti-racist, principles and ideas, there's a whole lot of space for like those same exact activities to be applied to, in addition to other agriculture and food related spaces that you mentioned, even like just like outdoor recreation festivals, block parties. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you can consider, community gardens. I mean, there are so many things that I think neighbors are trying to do together, and like being able to consider, okay, how do we market this opportunity so that it is truly inclusive, and and that our intention is communicated in that regard. And similarly, like mission, I think, having a moment and stopping and saying, okay, so why are we doing this? What is, our vision for our community? And then what is the mission for this particular experience or activity, whether it's a one-off festival or a seasonal market? Why are we doing this? And that also is an exercise that I think can go across all sorts of activities and opportunities, as well as measurement, right? I think to your point, sometimes we do need to bring this to like the scientific level. What are the questions we need to ask? What are the stories that we need to capture about people's experience in community and why they do or don't feel like they have and they're a space at the market or at a particular event? I think is something that causes us to pause and also helps to support the efforts moving forward. And that's also something that can apply across many different types of activities on behalf of community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I think I can speak a little bit to a couple of the M's as well in terms of mission, really articulating, what that changes that you want to be seen instead of assuming that folks are all on the same page. Oftentimes with this work, if we're around a lot of like-minded individuals, there's just kind of this collective assumption of like, oh, well, we're all in, like, we're all, at the same level of learning, or we all understand why this is important. And it's great to have that camaraderie, but it's even better if you can be articulative about it, if you can, share it and be direct and say, this is the vision that we have for our market. There's a lot of great examples in the toolkit of how to structure an anti-racist mission for your market.
Yeah,
Yeah. And then I think also that the measurement piece is so important too, for all of the reasons that you said, but also really for accountability, for making sure that we're doing what we say we're doing and that change is actually happening,
that's
right?
right.
Because we don't want to put all this effort in and then the market still looks the same, still feels the same, after that amount of time. So measurement and thinking through what are the metrics that you can collect that will help to show that there's been change in your community and your market.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. We're rounding out the hour, and so I want to see if there are any questions. I think we have one question in the chat so far, but if folks have other questions, please add them in there. We have quite a few minutes still left. There is a question from a market that says, we're planning to do a Juneteenth celebration for the first time this year. Any comments regarding events like this?
Oh my goodness, I love this. And I actually think that Juneteenth celebrations are like one of the best ways that a market can get the community engaged. I would not go again. I can't emphasize this enough. Like, do not go at this alone. Find, and there are for sure experts in your community around kind of whether it's specifically Juneteenth, but just kind of the history of Black folks in your community. Find those local folks, go to some of the local churches, see who, whether it's oral history or actually, documenting the stories, see who's doing that and have a conversation with them about what something like that can look like. And I think a Juneteenth acknowledgement, even if you are not ready to take on an entire event, an acknowledgement of the of that opportunity to consider the experience of Black folks in this country in that particular way is huge. That's it. But I would definitely get very clear advice and feedback from someone in the local community. I also would like to say that when you are thinking about some of the unique ways that Black folks organize and lead in community, it is this idea around cooperative economics. And so a Juneteenth celebration at a market can make sense when you're thinking about, okay, how do we highlight businesses, Black businesses that are meeting and serving the needs of Black folks in the community. Maybe it's not a regular market appropriate vendor, like someone that's not, always at the market, but for the Juneteenth celebration, it can be an opportunity to bring in some of those businesses that are not typically at the market, but are deeply rooted in addressing the needs of the Black community specifically.
Yeah, doing things in partnership, huge takeaway from the toolkit. I know there's a follow-up to that where the person asked so that they did a Pride Day last year and lost a few board members and a couple of vendors and a few shoppers. So there, sometimes there is a risk to doing this work. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I have to, I really, my gut reaction is bye, like,
Yeah, bye, Felicia.
see you later. But it's the reality is, yes, exactly what you said. I mean, change for a lot of people is very painful. They don't want to, those types of acknowledgements sometimes, maybe indicate again, like ownership that people are not willing to take. So they'd rather distance themselves from the change versus be like, wow, okay, yeah, we really have not done this right in the past. It is time. This era that we're living in now demands Pride Day be celebrated. It demands Black folks be celebrated. It demands the intersectionality of all of this stuff, right? So, and we do that by, incorporating things like, acknowledging Pride, by acknowledging Juneteenth, by incorporating some of these components of things. And then, more and more it becomes the collective story of the market. So yeah, I mean, there's going to be some fall off. There's absolutely no way around that.
Exactly. Yeah. And it goes back to that mission. If you have a strong mission to fall back on for your market that shows why this is important, why you want to do this work, and why it's transformational for your market. The acknowledgement that you're going to lose some folks along the way, but it's for a greater purpose. So
Yes.
any other questions that folks have, throw them in the chat. Otherwise, we can wrap up.
And we are hosting the Center for Civic Innovation. We are hosting a Juneteenth celebration, and I mean this. Like we are partnering with with community-based organizations and hoping to really have a dope day of pouring into Black business and really honoring the work that's being done to sustain the need, sustain Black communities and address the needs, and also celebrate and promote Black joy. So I think that, like, if that is the purpose and the intention of an event like Juneteenth, I think that there's no way you can go wrong. There will always be lessons, and when you live the market life, you figure that out, like you're like, okay, I got to be flexible. That's what's so great and why it's so timely for market leaders to be kind of driving this as agents of change, because you guys know y'all are flexible. You know what to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As Kat always says, our jobs are weird, right?
Absolutely.
The amount of things that you have to do as a market manager means flexibility is a necessity. But yeah, I think that piece around celebration and joy is so important too, right? Like we don't want to just wallow in the, like, here's everything that's gone wrong and the impact that it's had and the detriment. We want to focus on the value, on the incredible skills and perspectives and things that Black folks bring to our communities, and celebrate, that accomplishment, celebrate that diversity within your community. So the last question we have is a really good one to kind of lead us out. So what are some of the ways that markets can seek support directly from the work group members as they implement the toolkit? We talked a little bit about that, but
yeah, so one of the things that we're going to be working on kind of as a follow-up to the release of the toolkit are some preset kind of directions that we recommend that folks can take the toolkit, and then kind of also lining up toolkit members to be able to be responsive to those particular structures. So getting the feedback from them in terms of what they think some implementation strategies in general can be. And then really it's a combination of pairing the skills and talents of that particular maybe area of focus for implementation with the individuals that are the skills and talents of the individuals that might be a part of the working group that can support it. And then also location and availability, right? Because we do know that so much of this is very community like specific. So as much as we can, we want to make sure that we're able to come from a place of knowledge and understanding of the community that we're working with. And also, when and as long as it's safe and appropriate, be able to really get engaged with the community, because we know that that's a requirement for this work to sustain itself. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And on that, on the FMC website page for the toolkit, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, there is a form for our speakers bureau that's been formed with work group members. So there's a lot of different opportunities and different types of requests that can go into that form. If you click through it, there's like an introductory sort of presentation about the toolkit that would be more FMC and Sagdrina or Nedra, just doing a basic level introduction of the toolkit. There's an opportunity to ask a work group member to come and speak at a conference or like a session, or to do a workshop specifically, or to do some more of this in-depth consultation that Sagdrina is talking about in terms of actually implementing the toolkit and piloting in your market. And there's a lot of different ways to interact with the work group members. I think they're here for it. They're up for it. They're really excited that this toolkit is out in the world, and we want to continue to elevate their expertise and the perspective that they bring. So with that, I can wrap us up. We're right at the end of the hour. Thank you so much, Sagdrina, for your time today and for talking about the toolkit. And, you know, folks, if you haven't already read it, you definitely need to go check it out and spend some time just flipping through and really taking the time to reflect and think about how you can make some of these changes within your market. Anything you want to say, Sagdrina, to close us out?
No, I mean, you know, I'm so thankful to my colleagues who worked with me and really hung in there, you know, to pull this together. I'm super proud of it. We're all just like, wow, we did this. And again, shout out to Shiny for really bringing together not just the work, but the spirit of the group with the edits that she made. That was a game changer. And then also Amelia, our graphic designer, I think, you know, just making sure that we acknowledge that we had, you know, support all the way around by Black leadership, quite frankly, to get this done. And again, shout out to FMC, front of the house, back of the house, all of the house. I know you guys have really taken this work on as part of your personal or your organizational mission. And you, Rachel, I know it's part of your personal mission. So thank you guys for that.
Thank you, Sagdrina, and thanks y'all for chiming in. And we'll be back soon to talk with more work group members. I think that's the plan, to do some future Facebook Lives focusing on these 4 M's too. So definitely not the last you're going to hear about this toolkit or this work. So.
Absolutely.